Hello friends, and welcome to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to a different kind of historical space, one defined by suffocation, by quiet dread, and by the relentless, gnawing presence of unseen enemies. We invite you now to settle in, to let the gentle rhythm of these words ease your mind, and to simply allow your imagination to drift with us back through the centuries, into the very heart of a besieged city. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we step into a world where the very air around you subtly shifts, and the familiar embrace of stone walls, once a comfort, begins to subtly dim. Imagine the quiet apprehension, like a fine dust, settling over the lives of hundreds of thousands, as their vast, known universe terrifyingly shrinks to the confines of their homes and streets. In this rapidly diminishing world, a gnawing hunger, at first a distant concern, slowly and insidiously creeps into every thought, every sensation, every moment of waking and restless sleep. And alongside it, a profound despair takes hold, not the shock of sudden collapse, but the slow, creeping inevitability of a quiet thief, steadily stealing away hope, one precious breath at a time. Tonight, our journey begins at the very precipice of such a calamity. The initial moments, the chilling realization that a city is under siege. We will seek to understand why these protracted struggles were so often employed in the medieval world, and how their immediate impact, both psychologically and physically, began to transform the lives of those trapped within the shrinking world of their walls. It is a story not of a sudden explosion of conflict, but of a slow, inexorable tightening, a gradual closure around a vibrant community, turning it, by degrees, into a quiet, living tomb. More than just a wall of soldiers, a medieval siege was, at its heart, a meticulously calculated act of economic and logistical strangulation. It was a deliberate, patient, and often cruelly effective strategy designed not for swift conquest, but for the slow, agonizing exhaustion of a city's will to resist. Imagine, if you will, the strategic brilliance, or perhaps the chilling ruthlessness, of commanders who understood that human bodies, no matter how valiant, cannot long survive without sustenance. Their goal was to cut off all supply lines with an unyielding grip, ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, went in or out. Picture the roads leading into your city, once bustling with the vibrant commerce of daily life. The steady creak of merchants' carts, laden with sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, fresh vegetables, and bolts of cloth, was a familiar, comforting sound, a constant assurance of abundance and connection to the wider world. Now, imagine the subtle, almost imperceptible, shift as these sounds began to diminish. First, perhaps, a few fewer carts, then a growing silence where once there was a lively chorus of wheels and voices. The initial absence might be attributed to bad weather, or perhaps a minor skirmish on a distant road. But as days bled into weeks, and the once familiar stream of goods dwindled to a trickle, and then, terrifyingly, to nothing, the true horror of their predicament began to seep into the collective consciousness. The rivers, too, those ancient arteries of transport and life, would slowly cease their flow of vital supplies. Boats carrying timber, firewood, and trade goods would no longer dock at the city's quay. The quiet lapping of water against their hulls, a sound once synonymous with prosperity and movement, would be replaced by an unnerving stillness, reflecting only the unblinking sky. Even the hidden paths, the clandestine trails known only to smugglers or desperate travelers, would be relentlessly patrolled and cut off by the besieging forces. Every avenue of connection, every fragile thread linking the city to the outside, was systematically severed. The markets, once vibrant hubs of chatter and commerce, would become quiet testaments to this growing isolation. Initially, the stalls might still hold their wares, but prices would climb, steadily, silently, beyond the reach of ordinary folk. Then, the produce would begin to dwindle. The fresh greens would disappear, followed by the poultry, then the salted meats. The familiar aromas of baking bread and roasting meat would fade, replaced by a growing, hollow silence. The quiet desperation of empty baskets and increasingly desperate whispers would become the dominant sounds. It was a horrifying realization that crept into every home, every shared glance. The city, their home, was becoming an island, a solitary, vulnerable rock in an ocean of hostile forces, cut off from the very currents of life that sustained it. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic explosion of violence, but rather a slow, suffocating tightening of the noose, a gradual strangulation that promised not a swift end, but a prolonged, agonizing descent into deprivation and despair. The immediate impact of such a blockade on the populace was profoundly psychological. It wasn't merely the physical inconvenience of dwindling supplies. It was the chilling, pervasive sense of being utterly and irrevocably trapped. Imagine, if you will, waking each morning to the sight of enemy banners, flapping with a silent, menacing defiance just beyond the familiar comfort of your city walls. These were not just pieces of cloth. They were constant, looming symbols of hostile intent, a perpetual reminder that your home was no longer your sanctuary, but a cage. The very air seemed to thicken with their presence, casting a long, cold shadow over the ordinary rhythms of life. The constant awareness of hostile forces encircling their homes, the knowledge that beyond the immediate familiarity of their streets lay an insurmountable barrier of armed men, fostered a pervasive sense of entrapment. Every journey, once a simple walk to the well or the market, now became a stark reminder of the impenetrable cordon. The distant sounds of the besiegers, the occasional clang of hammer on metal as they constructed their engines, the low murmur of countless voices, the unseen movement of thousands of men, created a persistent, low hum of anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily existence. There was no escape, no easy route to safety, no distant horizon to offer comfort. The world, for all intents and purposes, had shrunk to the space within those besieged walls. This quiet terror, this creeping sense of imprisonment, permeated every home, every shared meal, every hushed conversation. The vibrant hum of a thriving community began to dissipate, replaced by a subtle, unsettling quiet. Laughter became rarer, voices softer, as if a collective breath was being held. The usual boisterousness of children, the lively gossip of market women, the convivial chatter in taverns, these sounds slowly faded, replaced by the hushed whispers of worry, the anxious eyes of parents, the fearful silence of those who had nothing left to say. The city, once a vibrant organism pulsating with life and human connection, began its grim transformation, not into a mere stronghold, but into a collective prison, its inhabitants sharing a common, inescapable fate. The familiar faces of neighbors and friends, once sources of comfort, now reflected a shared apprehension, a mirroring of the silent question in every heart. How long could they endure? For both the besieger and the besieged, a siege was, fundamentally, a desperate race against the clock. It was a grueling test of endurance, willpower, and logistical foresight. The attacking army, though seemingly in control, faced its own set of relentless pressures. Their goal was to force a surrender before their own extensive supplies dwindled, before disease inevitably began to take its toll on their own ranks. Crucially, before a relief army could arrive to lift the siege and turn the tables. Imagine the silent anxiety in the besieging camp, the careful calculations of their quartermasters, the constant watch for any movement on the distant horizon that might signal an approaching enemy. Their strength, though formidable, was finite, and every passing day meant a greater strain on their resources and their men. For those trapped inside, the race was far more immediate, far more viscerally felt. It was a desperate gamble against the inevitable depletion of their own meager resources. Every grain of wheat consumed, every drop of water drunk, was a quiet subtraction from a rapidly shrinking total. This wasn't merely an abstract calculation. It was a daily, agonizing awareness. The communal granaries, once overflowing, slowly revealed their wooden flaws. The sounds of grinding mills, once constant, grew intermittent and then ceased altogether. The water levels in the city wells visibly receded, each draw requiring more effort, more prayer. Every passing day became a quiet countdown, marked not by ticking clocks, but by the subtle, creeping signs of deprivation. The slow thinning of faces in the street, the weakening steps of once vigorous men, the increasing hunger pangs that became a constant, dull companion. These were the grim markers of time. With each sunrise, a deepening shadow was cast over their hopes. The initial defiance, born of civic pride and martial spirit, slowly began to erode under the relentless pressure of an empty stomach and an unyielding enemy. The very air seemed to hold a silent question. Would relief come before all was lost? Or would the silence of starvation become their ultimate answer? Medieval cities were not merely collections of buildings surrounded by stone walls. They were, in themselves, complex defensive systems, intricate puzzles of stone, wood, and human ingenuity. Picture the laid defenses, the outer ditches, perhaps filled with water, the massive, towering curtain walls punctuated by formidable gatehouses, the strategically placed towers offering vantage points for archers and watchmen. Within the walls, concentric rings of defense, narrow streets designed for ambush, and inner keeps provided further layers of resistance. Each element was a testament to centuries of accumulated knowledge in the art of protection, designed to absorb the shock of attack, to funnel attackers into kill zones, and to hold out against overwhelming force. The besiegers, in turn, were masters of countermeasures, their ingenuity mirroring that of the defenders. They brought forth an array of elaborate siege engines, monstrous wooden constructs designed to hurl massive stones, batter down gates, or allow attackers to scale walls. Imagine the distant, rhythmic thud of their construction, a sound that would carry ominously over the quiet city, a chilling soundtrack to their approaching doom. Trebuchets, carefully calibrated, would launch their deadly payloads, not just rocks, but sometimes even disease-ridden carcasses, a grim tactic to spread fear and pestilence within the walls. Ballistas would fire enormous bolts, while siege towers, slowly wheeled into position, became towering mobile fortresses from which attackers could rain down arrows and attempt to breach the ramparts. But beyond these visible, formidable machines, another, often unseen, battle played out, the quiet, methodical war of engineering. Undermining tunnels, dug patiently and secretly beneath the city walls, aimed to collapse foundations or to allow attackers to suddenly emerge within the city itself. Imagine the gnawing anxiety for the defenders, knowing that beneath their feet, in the silent earth, an unseen enemy might be burrowing. Counter-tunnels would be dug by the besieged, listening for the faint sounds of enemy picks and shovels, hoping to intercept and collapse the attackers' shafts. Earthworks, like mounds and ramps, would be painstakingly constructed by besiegers to gain height or to provide cover for their assault. This was a slow, deliberate contest of minds as much as muscle, one pickaxe swing, one carefully placed stone at a time, each side seeking to outmaneuver the other, inch by quiet inch. It was a testament to the fact that even in the brutal theater of medieval warfare, patience, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of physics were as crucial as courage and brute force. Even before the first arrow was truly loosed in anger over the walls, or the first battering ram struck against a gate, sieges began to claim their victims. Beyond the battlefield, the initial impact of a siege disproportionately fell upon the most vulnerable members of society. The elderly, already frail from a lifetime of toil, were often the first to succumb as food became scarce, and the usual comforts and care that sustained them gradually disappeared. Their quiet suffering, often hidden away in dimly lit homes, was a grim sign of the coming hardship for all. The very young, their fragile bodies still developing, were equally susceptible. Children, with their rapid metabolisms and undeveloped immune systems, quickly withered when nutrition became insufficient. Imagine the quiet cries of hunger, the hollowed eyes, the rapid decline of once lively spirits. The playful sounds of children, once a ubiquitous feature of city life, would slowly fade, replaced by a haunting silence, or the mournful laments of grieving parents. The sick, too, whether suffering from chronic ailments or sudden fevers, found their conditions rapidly exacerbated by the deteriorating conditions. With dwindling food, lack of clean water, and the general decline in sanitation, their chances of recovery plummeted. A simple cold could become a fatal pneumonia. A minor infection could rage unchecked in a weakened body. These were the quiet tragedies that unfolded in the initial days and weeks of a siege. They were not the dramatic deaths of warriors in battle, but the slow, agonizing fading of those least able to withstand the shock of deprivation. The increasing frequency of hushed funerals, the growing number of new graves in the churchyard, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the faces of the living, these were grim harbingers, silent prophesies of the horrors that were yet to come. These early, quiet casualties served as a chilling premonition, a stark warning to all within the walls of their world, and their very existence was now defined by a relentless, invisible enemy, one that had only just begun to unleash its devastating power. As the subtle grip of the siege tightened around the city, the initial anxieties of isolation quietly transformed into a more visceral, more profound dread, the gnawing hunger that began to consume every waking thought, every fleeting dream. This was perhaps the most brutal and pervasive weapon employed by besieging forces, a relentless assault not on stone walls, but on the very foundations of human endurance. We invite you now to simply listen, as we explore the agonizing descent into deprivation, the desperate measures taken to find even the slightest sustenance, and the ultimate, quiet breaking of societal norms as the human body and mind slowly succumb to the relentless march of starvation. It was a cruel, drawn-out battle, fought not with steel and fire, but with the empty ache in the belly, a constant companion that eroded hope, little by little, day by agonizing day. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a seemingly endless procession of quiet, hungry mornings, the city's once bustling food stores dwindled with a terrifying predictability. The initial comfort of full granaries and well-stocked larders slowly gave way to a growing emptiness. Sacks of grain, once piled high like miniature mountains of promise, gradually flattened. Barrels of dried meat and salted fish, once abundant, revealed their wooden bottoms with a hollow resonance. Provisions, carefully preserved for leaner times, were rationed with increasing severity, each measure becoming smaller, each portion more meager, until, inevitably, they too simply disappeared. Imagine, if you will, the quiet desperation that settled over families as they gathered for what could barely be called a meal. The hushed conversations, the averted gazes, the unspoken fear reflected in every eye as parents watched their children grow thinner, their faces losing the soft roundness of youth, their limbs becoming alarmingly delicate. The communal silence during these empty mealtimes grew heavier with each passing day, thick with the unspoken anxieties of hunger. Every rustle in the shadows, every faint skittering sound in the walls, became a desperate focus of attention, a fleeting thought that perhaps, just perhaps, a mouse or some other small creature could be caught, offering a moment's reprieve from the relentless ache. The once familiar aromas of cooking food, a comforting presence in any bustling medieval city, faded entirely, leaving behind only the cold, still air and the constant, dull throb of hunger. The vibrant energy that had once pulsed through the city's veins now slowed, replaced by a profound weariness, a growing lethargy that was born not of exertion, but of relentless, grinding emptiness. This was the quiet, insidious beginning of a different kind of ending, not with a roar, but with a silent, agonizing whimper. When the conventional sources of food finally ran out, as they inevitably did in prolonged sieges, the inhabitants were pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, resorting to anything, absolutely anything, that could conceivably be called edible. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic descent into madness, but a quiet, agonizing progression of desperation. We are speaking here of a diet that would be unthinkable in any other circumstance, a grim menu forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. Imagine the quiet, furtive movements as individuals sought out rats, creatures once reviled as vermin, now viewed with a desperate, hungry glint in the eye. Dogs and cats, once cherished companions or useful working animals, became sources of protein, their absence from the streets a chilling indicator of the deepening crisis. The tough, sinewy leather from belts, shoes, or even book bindings would be boiled for hours, painstakingly softened, perhaps attempting to extract some meager nutritional value, leaving behind a rubbery, tasteless residue. Even the green shoots of grass sprouting between cobblestones, or the desperate scraping of moss from damp walls, might be consumed in a futile attempt to quiet the stomach's incessant demands. The very bones of animals, long since stripped clean, would be boiled repeatedly, perhaps yielding a thin, greasy broth, a pale imitation of nourishment, yet clutched at as a lifeline. Accounts from historical sieges paint a stark and quiet testament to the depths of this hunger. During the harrowing siege of Paris in 885 to 886, chroniclers, with a chilling matter-of-factness, reported that citizens were reduced to boiling leather for what they desperately hoped would be soup, its faint, gamey smell a cruel trick on their famished senses. And while much later in history, the agonizing siege of Leningrad during World War II echoes these ancient horrors, with desperate citizens resorting to consuming wallpaper paste and bread laced with sawdust, demonstrating that across the centuries, the human response to such deprivation remains horrifyingly consistent. This was a silent, grim alchemy, transforming the utterly unpalatable into the desperately necessary, a quiet battle against the body's primal screams for sustenance. In the most extreme and prolonged of these sieges, a silence deeper than the absence of food would sometimes fall over the starving populace, a silence born of a horror almost unspeakable, an ultimate taboo shattered by the brutal exigencies of survival. Instances of cannibalism, though thankfully rare and often whispered about in horrified tones rather than openly discussed, are indeed documented in the grimmest annals of history. During the First Crusade siege of Myra in 1098, Crusaders, pushed to the absolute brink of starvation, reportedly resorted to this ultimate act after conquering the city. This was not the rampage of a bloodthirsty horde, driven by malice or savagery. Instead, it was often a quiet, agonizing decision, born from the deepest, most primal need to survive, a horrifying choice made in the darkest corners of human endurance. The very thought of it sends a shiver through time, a testament to the unimaginable pressures that could force such a profound violation of human dignity. For those who witnessed it, or were even forced to consider it, the horror of such moments haunted them, a silent, indelible scar upon their souls for the rest of their lives. The memory would linger like a cold, persistent shadow, a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization could become when stripped bare by the relentless teeth of hunger. Starvation, in its slow, methodical march, wrought profound and devastating havoc on the human body. Emaciation became the universal condition. Bodies once robust and vital, now hollowed out, their bones sharply delineated beneath parchment-thin skin. Weakness was a constant companion, every movement requiring immense effort, every step a struggle. Muscles, once firm and active, atrophied, simply wasting away as the body consumed itself in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Organ failure, a quiet internal collapse, became increasingly common, the systems of the body simply shutting down under the prolonged assault of deprivation. The once bustling streets, which had gradually quieted in the early days of the siege, now seemed to fill with shuffling, skeletal figures. Their movements were slow and deliberate, each gesture an act of profound conservation, their energy too precious to expend on anything but the sheer necessity of survival. Their eyes, once bright with life and emotion, grew hollow, sunken deep within their sockets, reflecting a profound and quiet emptiness. The city itself, in this agonizing phase, transformed into a quiet graveyard of living ghosts, their presence a haunting testament to the silent, unrelenting power of hunger. But the ravages of hunger extended far beyond the physical body. It also, insidiously, began to erode the very architecture of the mind, pushing individuals to a profound psychological breaking point. Apathy became a widespread condition, a dull, pervasive indifference that settled over the populace like a shroud. The will to fight, to hope, to even care, slowly withered away. Irrationality often surfaced, as the starved brain struggled to function, leading to erratic decisions, baseless suspicions, and a general breakdown in logical thought. The complex tapestry of social cohesion, the intricate web of trust and cooperation that bound a community together, began to fray and unravel under the immense and constant pressure. People who had once been vibrant, engaged members of society became mere shells of their former selves, their personalities muted, their spirits dimmed. The quiet desperation that had initially permeated the city gradually transformed into a profound, soul-crushing lethargy. This was the final, quiet stage before surrender, or more often, before the final, merciful release of death. The mind, too, succumbed to the gnawing hunger, leaving behind only an exhausted, hollow echo of what was once human. As the silent grip of starvation tightened its hold, another, equally insidious enemy began to stir within the besieged city's walls, often more devastating than any sword or famine, the unseen killer of disease. This was a foe that exploited the very conditions of the siege itself, thriving in filth and despair, quietly claiming lives with a speed and ruthlessness that mirrored, and often surpassed, the most brutal acts of warfare. We invite you now to simply listen, as we turn our attention to the grim reality of sanitation breakdown, the terrifying spread of epidemics, and the desperate, often futile, struggles against an invisible assailant that transformed besieged cities into quiet, pervasive charnel houses. Medieval urban environments, even in times of peace, were rarely bastions of hygiene. Cities were typically crowded, with populations living in close quarters, often without adequate systems for waste disposal. Open sewers were common, draining refuse directly into rivers or simply accumulating in cesspits and on the streets. The daily struggle against dirt and grime was a constant companion to urban life. However, under the extraordinary pressures of a siege, these already challenging conditions deteriorated with horrifying rapidity and intensity. Imagine, if you will, the cessation of daily routines, the breakdown of civic order that once, however imperfectly, managed the city's waste. Clean water, once drawn from wells or channeled aqueducts, became a precious, dwindling resource, increasingly contaminated as sanitation systems failed. Latrines, once managed with some semblance of order, quickly overflowed, spilling their foul contents into the streets, creating rivers of effluent that mingled with the quiet despair of the populace. The dead, both human and animal, could not always be properly buried, their decaying bodies adding to the putrid tapestry of the besieged city. Confined spaces, the very walls that offered protection from the enemy outside, became breeding grounds for unseen horrors within. The air itself would grow thick with an overwhelming stench, a sickening cocktail of human waste, decay, and unwashed bodies, a smell that would cling to clothing, permeate homes, and become an inescapable part of the daily reality. Flies, drawn by the filth, would swarm in buzzing clouds, landing indiscriminately on food, on faces, on open wounds, carrying unseen threats. And rats, those quiet, furtive creatures of the shadows, once a nuisance, now became visible in startling numbers, scuttling through the streets, brazenly scavenging, silent vectors of disease, their very presence a grim promise of contagion. This was a world transformed, not by violent assault, but by the quiet, creeping tide of filth, a silent, festering wound that permeated every corner of the city. These utterly unsanitary conditions, coupled with the weakened state of a starving populace, created an almost perfect breeding ground for epidemics, allowing disease to spread with terrifying speed and quiet inevitability. It was an invisible enemy, more relentless and often more lethal than any siege engine. Imagine the subtle signs of its presence: a single cough in a crowded tenement, a quiet fever whispered about in the market, a sudden bout of debilitating weakness. Such symptoms, once perhaps dismissed as minor ailments, now carried the chill of dread, for they were the harbingers of widespread sickness. Diseases like dysentery, with its debilitating internal ravages, would sweep through the populace, spreading rapidly through contaminated water and food, leaving its victims utterly weakened and dehydrated. Typhoid, with its insidious fevers and internal bleeding, would silently claim lives, its victims growing delirious and unresponsive. Typhus, spread by the very fleas and lice that thrived in unwashed bodies and crowded conditions, would bring on agonizing fevers, rashes, and a profound weariness that often culminated in death. Even the dread plague, when it found its way into such a vulnerable population, would unleash its full fury, its quiet, swift horror magnified by the lack of escape. Smallpox, too, with its disfiguring and often fatal progression, would find fertile ground amongst the weakened and unimmunized. There was no escaping the silent, invisible assault. The disease moved through the city like a creeping fog, touching one family, then another, then an entire street, its progress marked by the increasing number of still forms, the quiet cries of suffering, and the growing sense of helplessness. This was a quiet kind of terror, a fear of what could not be seen, could not be fought with a sword, and could not be reasoned with. The medical response to such widespread epidemics in the medieval period was tragically limited, a desperate struggle against forces far beyond the understanding and capabilities of the time. Imagine the quiet despair of the city's physicians and healers, their knowledge rooted in ancient texts and rudimentary practices, now confronted with an onslaught of sickness for which they had no true remedies. Their attempts at treatment were often based on theories of humors and imbalances, involving bloodletting, purging, or the application of herbal poultices, measures that were largely ineffective against virulent pathogens and, at worst, could even hasten death. There were no antibiotics to combat bacterial infections, no vaccines to prevent viral outbreaks, no sophisticated understanding of germ theory. Their helplessness was profound, a quiet acknowledgement of their limitations in the face of such overwhelming suffering. Hope, for many, rested less on the skill of the physician and more on the fervent prayers offered in the churches, or on the desperate application of folk remedies, whispered down through generations, often proving equally futile. The fear of contagion, too, played a significant role, leading to the quiet isolation of the sick, often in their own homes, where families would face the agonizing choice between tending to their loved ones and risking their own infection. This created a profound sense of loneliness for the afflicted, and a crushing burden of fear and grief for those who cared for them, knowing, with a quiet certainty, that their efforts were likely to be in vain. The sounds of suffering, once perhaps audible as individual cries, would blend into a low, pervasive hum across the city, a quiet chorus of communal pain. In some of the darkest chapters of medieval siege warfare, disease was not merely an unfortunate consequence of unsanitary conditions, but was deliberately, chillingly, wielded as a weapon. This was an act of quiet, chilling desperation on the part of the besiegers, a recognition that the unseen killer could often achieve what the most formidable siege engines could not. Imagine, if you will, the unsettling sight of diseased corpses, whether human or animal, perhaps victims of the very plague or dysentery that afflicted the besieging camp, being hurled over the city walls by catapults or trebuchets. This was not merely an act of intimidation. It was a deliberate attempt to introduce contagion directly into the heart of the besieged population, to hasten the spread of sickness and break the city's will from within. In other instances, the besiegers might attempt to contaminate the city's water supply, diverting polluted streams or introducing decaying matter into vital conduits, turning a source of life into a vector of death. The psychological impact of such tactics was immense, breeding a profound terror of an invisible, unstoppable enemy that could not be seen, could not be fought with arms, and offered no quarter. The very air might seem tainted, the water poisoned, every breath a silent gamble. This was a silent, insidious form of warfare, preying on the most fundamental human fears, undermining morale with the chilling promise of inevitable, agonizing death at the hands of an unseen assailant. It was a testament to the brutal calculus of survival, where even the most abhorrent tactics became permissible in the relentless pursuit of victory. Ultimately, the silent, relentless march of disease during a siege often claimed more lives than direct combat, far more than the swords of attacking soldiers or the rocks hurled by siege engines. The death toll would mount with terrifying rapidity, transforming the city into a quiet, pervasive charnel house. Imagine the overwhelming number of dead bodies, the grim practicalities of disposal quickly becoming insurmountable. Families struggled to perform proper burials for their loved ones, the rites of passage becoming truncated, undignified affairs. Mass graves became a necessity, hastily dug pits where bodies, stripped of their individuality, were interred with a grim efficiency, blurring the lines between citizen and anonymous victim. The very act of living became a constant navigation of death, the presence of the deceased a stark and inescapable reality. The psychological trauma of witnessing such widespread, constant death and loss was profound and lingering. Grief became a communal burden, its quiet weight pressing down on every soul. The familiar faces of neighbors and friends disappeared with alarming regularity, leaving behind gaping holes in the social fabric, a sense of profound emptiness. The city, once vibrant and bustling, would fall into a silent, mournful stillness, punctuated only by the quiet sounds of sickness and the hushed movements of those who remained, a testament to the devastating power of the unseen killer. The memories of such a time would linger for generations, a quiet haunting in the collective consciousness of the survivors, an indelible scar left by the silent, relentless hand of pestilence. As the twin specters of starvation and disease tightened their unforgiving grip, the besieged city began to face its most insidious enemy yet, the quiet, internal collapse of its own spirit. The relentless physical suffering, combined with the profound psychological toll of isolation and fear, gradually eroded the very fabric of human resilience, pushing individuals and the community as a whole towards a terrifying breaking point. We invite you now to simply listen, as we explore the slow, agonizing decline of morale, the quiet breakdown of authority, and the chilling erosion of social norms that transformed once vibrant communities into landscapes of suspicion and despair. This was a battle fought not with swords, but in the quiet, desperate corners of the human heart, where hope itself became a dwindling, precious commodity. Imagine, if you will, the slow, agonizing erosion of hope, a gradual fading of light that settled over the besieged populace like a persistent, cold fog. In the initial days of the siege, there might have been a fierce defiance, a shared determination to resist, fueled by civic pride and the belief in eventual relief. But as days bled into weeks, and weeks into an agonizing eternity, that initial resolve began to crack, quietly, insidiously. The daily grind of hunger, a constant, gnawing emptiness in the gut, combined with the debilitating weakness of disease and the pervasive chill of fear, slowly chipped away at their collective spirit. Each meal that wasn't, each family member lost to the unseen killer, each distant, unanswered prayer for a relief army, these were quiet blows, small but relentless, that wore down the will to endure. The vibrant hum of life that had once pulsed through the city, even in its quieted state, gradually diminished further, replaced by a profound weariness, a sense of resignation that weighed heavily on every soul. The very faces in the street, once showing signs of active worry or desperate resolve, now often bore an expression of passive endurance, a quiet acceptance of a fate that seemed increasingly inevitable. The transition from active defiance to this passive resignation was subtle, almost imperceptible day by day, yet profoundly transformative, marking a shift from fighting for life to simply waiting for its end. The initial fervent prayers, once filled with desperate hope, became quiet, rote recitations, devoid of true expectation, simply a mournful echo in the stillness of the besieged city. With the relentless pressure of starvation and disease mounting, the once unquestioned authority of the city's leaders began to fracture, quietly, insidiously, from within. Mayors, captains of the guard, and even religious figures, once revered and obeyed, found their commands increasingly challenged, their very legitimacy undermined by the palpable suffering of the populace. Imagine the quiet murmurs of dissent that would begin to spread through the crowded streets, hushed whispers in the communal bread lines that grew longer and thinner each day, or in the hushed gatherings where families mourned their dead. These were not always outright rebellions, but a more subtle, yet equally potent, form of insubordination, a quiet questioning of orders, a growing reluctance to follow directives that seemed to offer no respite from the daily agony. Soldiers, once disciplined and loyal, might begin to hoard their own meager rations, or turn a blind eye to quiet acts of theft amongst their comrades. Citizens might refuse to participate in the dwindling civic duties, seeing no purpose in maintaining order when chaos seemed so near. The very legitimacy of the established order, built on trust and the promise of protection, crumbled under the relentless weight of desperation. The feeling of the city unraveling from within was palpable, a chilling echo of the physical decay that surrounded them. Every unfulfilled promise, every failed attempt to find food or halt the spread of sickness, chipped away at the trust placed in those meant to lead. The once clear lines of command blurred, replaced by a quiet, pervasive anarchy where individual survival began to supersede all collective responsibility. The shared future, once a rallying cry, became a distant, mocking dream, leaving only the stark, immediate present. As hunger gnawed and disease spread, the very foundations of human society, the unwritten rules of civility and compassion, began to erode with terrifying speed. Imagine the quiet, desperate acts of selfishness that, once unthinkable, now became alarmingly commonplace. The communal spirit, which might have initially brought neighbors together in shared adversity, slowly withered, replaced by a chilling suspicion. Hoarding, once condemned as greed, became a necessary, furtive act of individual survival. A neighbor might quietly deny a portion of their meager findings to another, a choice that would have once brought immense shame, but now was simply a matter of a silent, agonizing calculation of their own family's survival. Theft, once a crime, became a desperate measure, committed in the shadows, fueled by the relentless pangs of hunger. Betrayal, whether of trust or of a shared secret, could quietly occur for the promise of a scrap of food or a moment's safety. The breakdown of communal support networks was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this decline. The very empathy that binds humanity together, the natural inclination to aid those in distress, began to recede, as individual survival became paramount. Every interaction became fraught with unspoken tension, every glance a quiet assessment of threat or opportunity. The once familiar streets of their city transformed into a landscape where the veneer of civilization was stripped away, revealing the raw, primal struggle beneath. This wasn't a sudden, violent upheaval, but a slow, insidious corrosion of the human spirit, a quiet descent into a world where every man and woman was, in their heart of hearts, fighting alone against the twin specters of hunger and death. In these dire circumstances, individuals were often forced into quiet, agonizing choices, desperate acts born of unimaginable duress. Escape, for some, became the only flickering beacon of hope, even knowing the immense risks involved. Imagine the clandestine plans, whispered in the dead of night, to scale the formidable walls, to brave the armed patrols, to navigate the unknown, hostile lands beyond the city's perimeter. These were not grand, heroic escapes, but furtive, desperate attempts, often undertaken by individuals or small, terrified groups, driven by the absolute certainty of death if they remained. Most attempts would fail, leading to quiet capture, always a silent, unseen demise in the treacherous no-man's land between the walls and the besieging camp. Others, driven to a quiet fury, might contemplate acts of sabotage against the besiegers, attempting to set fire to siege engines under the cover of darkness, or trying to contaminate their water supplies, small acts of defiance that often carried immense personal risk but offered a fleeting sense of agency. Within the city itself, the quiet desperation could sometimes escalate into internal unrest. As supplies dwindled to nothing and hope vanished, groups of desperate citizens might quietly demand food from the wealthy, or challenge the authority of the remaining gods. These were not revolutions, but surges of raw, desperate human need, often quelled with difficulty, sometimes tragically, by the very forces meant to protect them. Every day brought with it a renewed, agonizing search for any kind of solution, however fleeting, however dangerous, however morally compromising. These were the quiet, tragic decisions that defined the breaking point of a siege, moments when the human spirit, pushed beyond its limits, grappled with the most fundamental questions of survival and morality. The memory of these choices, made in the deepest shadows of despair, would forever mark the souls of those who endured. The siege, even for those who miraculously survived its physical horrors, left behind profound and lasting psychological scars, quiet wounds that lingered long after the enemy had departed and the walls were rebuilt. Imagine the trauma of witnessing such widespread suffering, the daily procession of death, the emaciated forms of loved ones, the quiet anguish of starvation, and the horrifying ravages of disease. These images and sensations would be seared into the collective memory, replaying themselves in restless dreams and quiet waking moments. Guilt, too, would often settle over the survivors like a heavy shroud. The guilt of survival when so many others perished, the guilt of quiet acts of selfishness committed in the name of necessity, the guilt of unspoken thoughts and desperate wishes. The memories of gnawing hunger, of the agonizing loss of dignity, of the sheer, overwhelming emptiness, would forever define their relationship with food, with security, with the very concept of peace. Populations were decimated, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The fabric of society, once torn by desperation, would take generations to mend, if it ever fully did. The quiet rebuilding of walls and homes, the re-establishment of markets and routines, could never truly erase the indelible marks left on the survivors. The experience of a medieval siege, in its profound physical and psychological impact, etched itself into the collective consciousness, a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for both profound suffering and extraordinary, quiet endurance. The whispers of those long-ago agonies, though centuries removed, still resonate faintly, if we choose to listen, in the annals of history. As the long, agonizing days of the siege bled into weeks and months, and the city's inhabitants succumbed to the relentless pressures of starvation, disease, and fracturing morale, there would often come a point where the stalemate could no longer hold. This was the precipice of the siege's true climax, a moment defined by desperate gambles, shattering walls, and the terrifying, quiet decisions that would determine the fate of thousands. We invite you now to simply listen, as we turn our attention to the final, brutal acts of these prolonged struggles, the desperate sallies of the besieged, the terrifying success of a breach, and the ultimate, agonizing choices between continued resistance, quiet surrender, or the horrifying chaos of a sack. Occasionally, from within the besieged walls, a flicker of desperate hope, or perhaps a final, grim resolve, would manifest in a desperate sally. This was a tactical maneuver born not of strength, but of utter necessity, a desperate gamble by the defenders to disrupt the besieging forces, to forage for desperately needed supplies, or simply to break the suffocating blockade and draw the enemy into an open fight, any fight that might offer a chance for a decisive, if unlikely, victory. Imagine the quiet, grim determination that would settle over the Salad forces as they prepared in the pre-dawn darkness. These were often not the city's finest warriors, but the last able-bodied men, perhaps even desperate citizens armed with whatever could be fashioned into a weapon, their faces gaunt from hunger, their eyes burning with a fleeting, desperate hope. The very act of opening the gates, of venturing beyond the perceived safety of the walls, was an act of profound courage born of utter despair. The quiet, muffled sounds of that desperate charge across the no-man's land between the city and the enemy lines would build, briefly, to an intense, chaotic clash. The quiet shouts of defiance, the hurried clang of steel on steel, the gasps of exertion, these would echo for a short, brutal period, quickly subsumed by the overwhelming might of the besieging army. Most sallies ended swiftly and quietly, with heavy losses for the defenders, the survivors retreating back through their gates, their desperate hope extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, still silence of yet another failed attempt. Their return, marked by the quiet solemnity of defeat and the absence of many familiar faces, would cast an even deeper shadow of despair over the already suffering populace, a chilling confirmation that escape, by force, was unlikely. While the desperate sallies offered fleeting, often futile, moments of engagement, the more insidious and terrifying threat came from the slow, methodical work of the besiegers, determined to physically dismantle the city's final protection, its walls. Imagine the quiet dread that would seep into the daily lives of the besieged as the sounds of picks and shovels, distant but unmistakable, began to emanate from beneath their feet, signaling the silent, unseen work of mining parties. These tunnels, dug patiently towards the city's foundations, aimed to undermine sections of the wall, to be later collapsed by fire or the sheer weight of the earth above. The rhythmic thud of a battering ram, a monstrous log suspended by ropes, its head often clad in iron, would echo relentlessly against a gate or a weakened section of wall, each blow a slow, agonizing countdown to potential disaster. Or perhaps, the quiet, ominous creak of a massive siege tower, slowly wheeled closer and closer to the ramparts, a towering wooden behemoth designed to deposit enemy soldiers directly onto the city's defenses. The defenders would work frantically, quietly, attempting to countermine, to drop stones and fire onto rams, to set fire to towers, but often their efforts were a desperate rearguard action against a relentless, overwhelming force. Then, inevitably, there would come the moment of the breach. It was rarely a sudden, dramatic explosion, but often a crumbling, a tearing sound, the quiet groan of ancient stone giving way, the muffled roar of falling masonry. A section of the wall, or a gatehouse, would simply collapse, creating a gaping wound in the city's hardened shell. For the defenders, the horrifying realization that their final, tangible protection had fallen would wash over them with a quiet, sickening certainty. The wall, the very symbol of their security and defiance, was now broken, and with it, often, their last vestige of hope. The breach was an open door, not just to the enemy soldiers, but to the full, devastating horrors of the sack, a quiet promise of destruction. Once a breach was made, or the walls successfully scaled. The ensuing storming of the city was a period of brutal, chaotic intensity, often brief in duration but devastating in its impact. This was when the disciplined, measured tension of the siege erupted into a violent, yet often localized, explosion of conflict and terror. We must acknowledge the violence of these moments, while carefully avoiding any graphic descriptions, focusing instead on the pervasive fear and the chilling loss of order. Imagine the sudden, quiet shouts of alarm as enemy soldiers poured through the breach, their numbers overwhelming. The sounds of desperate, fragmented defense would briefly erupt in the streets, the hurried clash of steel, the muffled cries of individuals, the quiet, heavy thud of bodies falling. The well-ordered lines of defenders, who had so valiantly manned the walls, now found themselves fighting a losing battle in the labyrinthine streets, their organized resistance quickly dissolving into isolated pockets of desperate courage. The shift from a structured, strategic defense to a chaotic, street-by-street struggle was immediate and terrifying. Homes, once sanctuaries, became places of fleeting hiding or sudden, brutal confrontation. The quiet understanding, for many, was that the end had truly come, and with it, the terrifying uncertainty of their immediate future. For a brief, brutal period, the city would become a zone of unimaginable terror, the quiet desperation now replaced by a raw, primal fear, as the victorious army pressed its advantage. In the face of such overwhelming odds, and with the walls breached, the very lifeblood of the city threatened, the agonizing process of negotiating surrender often began. This was a complex, tense, and profoundly difficult undertaking, conducted in hushed tones, surrounded by the quiet hum of fear and despair. Imagine the city's remaining leaders, perhaps the mayor, a military captain, or a prominent noble, making their way, under a white flag of truce, to the besiegers' camp. Their faces would be gaunt, their eyes heavy with sleepless nights and unshakable dread, carrying the immense burden of thousands of lives in their quiet deliberations. Their desperate attempts were to secure terms that might offer some semblance of safety for the remaining civilians, a preservation of property, or at the very least, an honorable end to the bloodshed. But the power imbalance was absolute, starkly evident in the quiet, unyielding faces of the victorious commanders. The besieged, with nothing left to offer but their lives, were in no position to bargain. Their quiet pleading for mercy, for leniency, often met with cold, strategic calculation. The terms of surrender could range wildly, sometimes surprisingly lenient, if the besiegers were weary, short on supplies, or wished to spare their own men further fighting. More often, however, they were harsh and unforgiving, designed to humiliate the defeated and to extract maximum tribute. The quiet agreement, when it was finally reached, would ripple back through the city not as a celebration, but as a sigh of exhausted relief mixed with profound apprehension, marking the official end of their defiance and the terrifying beginning of an unknown future under the conqueror's rule. If surrender terms could not be reached, or if the city was stormed outright, particularly after a long and brutal siege, the immediate aftermath was often defined by the profound horrors of a sack. This was a period of uncontrolled pillage, violence, and systematic destruction, where the very concept of order dissolved. We must acknowledge these realities, while maintaining our detached, unexcited tone, focusing on the quiet devastation and the enduring terror for the survivors. Imagine the sounds that would now fill the city, not the disciplined clamor of an army, but the cacophony of breaking, of splintering wood, of shattering pottery, of the quiet cries of despair. Houses would be systematically stripped of anything of value. Food, coin, valuables, even the very clothes from people's backs. The systematic stripping of resources, undertaken with a grim efficiency by the victorious soldiers, left nothing behind but emptiness. Flames, quietly consuming timber and thatch, would begin to creep through districts, often engulfing entire sections of the city. For the survivors, having endured so much, the hunger, the disease, the psychological torment, to now face this final, brutal stripping away of everything they held dear, was a quiet, profound despair, a crushing sense of total loss. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of conquest, a final, brutal testament to the medieval siege power to not only conquer a city but to utterly break the spirits of its inhabitants, leaving behind only quiet ruin and the indelible scars of memory. After the agonizing, drawn-out torment of a medieval siege, whether it ended in a desperate surrender, a brutal storming, or a miraculous relief, there would invariably come a moment when the immediate, overwhelming pressure lifted. This was the quiet cessation of the active nightmare, a moment of profound, if exhausted, relief for those who had miraculously endured. We invite you now to simply listen, as we explore this tenuous transition from active suffering to the grim reality of survival, the quiet imposition of occupation, and the deep, enduring scars, both physical and psychological, that lingered for generations, shaping the very soul of a city and its people. This final chapter seeks to understand that long, slow process of healing, or perhaps simply enduring, in the aftermath of such unimaginable hardship. Imagine, if you will, the profound quiet that would descend upon the city once the siege truly ended. After weeks or months of constant tension, the distant sounds of enemy camps, the thud of siege engines, the cries of the hungry and the sick, the very air seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sudden, almost disorienting, stillness. For those who had survived, who had clung to life through starvation and disease, this moment brought an overwhelming exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that settled into every limb, every fiber of their being. It wasn't a moment for boisterous celebration, but for a quiet, stunned euphoria, a fragile relief that was almost too fragile to acknowledge, a brief, precious respite from the incessant horrors that had defined their lives for so long. The first movements would be tentative, almost disbelieving. Perhaps a quiet opening of a door, a cautious step into a street that had, for so long, been a scene of terror or despair. The silence was not always comforting. It often held the ghostly echoes of the suffering that had just passed, a hollow space where so much life had once thrived. This was the stark contrast between the external end of the siege, the departure of the enemy or the entry of their own forces, and the internal continuation of suffering, the quiet re-entry into a world that was forever changed, forever marked by the crucible they had just endured. For many, the very concept of normal had vanished, replaced by an acute awareness of fragility, of the precariousness of life. The very act of standing, of breathing, became a quiet, profound victory in itself. Yet, for many cities, the end of the siege did not bring true liberation, but merely the grim reality of occupation. If the city had been conquered, either through surrender or by force, the departing enemy was replaced by a new, equally formidable presence, the victorious army now becoming the quiet masters. Imagine the imposing sight of new banners, foreign standards now unfurling from the city's highest towers, symbols of a new dominion. This transition often involved the immediate imposition of harsh new rules, a quiet dismantling of the old civic structures and the establishment of a new, often alien, order. Harsh taxes would be levied upon the impoverished populace, squeezing what little resources remained, turning their quiet endurance into economic subjugation. Property, particularly that of former leaders or those who resisted, would be confiscated, quietly transferred to the new ruling elite, leaving families destitute and dispossessed. The familiar rhythms of daily life, once dictated by their own customs and laws, now fell under the shadow of the new conquerors, a profound loss of autonomy that stripped the city of its very identity. The quiet rebuilding of physical structures, the painstaking repair of walls and homes, would begin, but it was a rebuilding undertaken not with the joy of recovery, but under the constant, watchful gaze of foreign soldiers, a silent reminder of their subjugation. This was a long, slow road to recovery for the shattered city and its populace, a journey fraught with resentment and quiet resistance, a period where survival meant navigating a complex web of new power dynamics and enduring the subtle, yet pervasive, presence of an occupying force that shaped every aspect of their existence, leaving an indelible mark on their collective memory. Beyond the immediate political and economic changes, the most profound and enduring legacy of a medieval siege lay in the quiet, pervasive scars it left behind, both on the physical landscape and, far more deeply, on the human spirit. Imagine returning to streets you once knew, now utterly devastated. The towering walls, once symbols of protection, now stood in ruin, gaping holes testament to the violence they had endured. Burnt-out buildings, their skeletons reaching to the sky, spoke of the destructive power of flame. Entire districts reduced to quiet ash and rubble. Homes, once filled with the warmth of family and the murmur of daily life, now stood empty, stripped bare or utterly destroyed, silent witnesses to absence and loss. The very topography of the city would be irrevocably altered, a landscape of quiet ruin and desolation. And within this altered landscape, the most heartbreaking scar of all, the decimated population. The quiet absence of so many familiar faces, the profound demographic shift as countless lives were extinguished by starvation, disease, or violence. Grief became a permanent resident, a quiet, heavy presence that settled over every surviving family, every street, every public gathering. The memory of the horrors, the gnawing hunger, the silent spread of disease, the terrifying collapse of society, the brutal moments of assault and sack, would be etched into the collective consciousness of the survivors, passed down through quiet stories, warnings, and unspoken anxieties for generations to come. The profound psychological wounds, the lingering trauma of witnessing such suffering, the pervasive fear, the quiet guilt of survival, the deep-seated distrust of outsiders, and even of neighbors, would fester unseen, shaping personalities and communities long after the last enemy soldier had departed. The quiet rebuilding of walls and homes, a tangible act of recovery, could never truly erase these indelible marks left on the survivors, these invisible scars on their very souls, a testament to the fact that some wounds, though unseen, never truly heal.